Good afternoon, bienvenue. Welcome to the Public Policy Forum's Rebuild Canada Growth Summit. Je suis Yolande James et j'ai le privilège d'animer ce sommet sur la croissance, rebâtir le Canada. I'm very happy to be hosting this summit with you all. The PPF team has put together a really exciting program with very impressive speakers. If I could, I'd like to begin with a virtual land acknowledgement. Ordinarily, I should say, when PPF hosts its events in Ottawa, PPF hosts them on unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. However, if I can ask, wherever you are, if you could just take a moment to acknowledge the traditional territory of the Indigenous people, have them in your thoughts as we extend our respect to all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people for their valuable past and present contribution to the land that we call Canada. This is PPF's fifth Canada Growth Summit. And in light of the ongoing pandemic, as you can see, we're doing things a little bit differently this year. The entire summit will be virtual and will be taking place over a 4-week period beginning today through to November 10th. It's 4 weeks, 2 sessions a week. Generally, the program will include 2 sessions, one on Monday, one on Tuesday, with fireside chats, with prominent speakers or 1 or 2 speakers from business, politics, or the public service. And the theme of the summit will build off of PPF's Rebuild Canada initiatives, which aims to identify the policy pathways to building a productive, resilient, and fair post-pandemic Canadian economy and society. You can get more details or more information is available via the Feed Loop Sessions tab, or you can go straight to the PPF website. Vous savez que l'équipe vous propose un excellent programme avec des conférenciers d'envergure. Je vous encourage fortement de consulter Feed Loop ou aller directement sur le site web du forum pour tous les détails. Et évidemment, avant de commencer, vous me permettrez de prendre quelques instants pour remercier nos partenaires. Without our partners, this summit would not at all be possible. So allow me to thank first our lead partners, CIBC and Microsoft, and our supporting partners, Business Development Bank of Canada, Bell, Chartered Professional Accountants of Canada, Deloitte, National Public Relations, and the Globe and Mail. So, as we're about to get started, let me just lay out what the session is how the sessions is going to take place. We're going to begin with some opening remarks by PPF's President and CEO, Edward Greenspan, after which we will have our fireside chat between Stephen Poloz and Bryant Bohenicki. Before I pass things off to Ed, I would like to remind you, after the chat between Brian and Stephen, we will have the opportunity to take your questions. So please feel free to go into the chat and send us your questions, and I'll be happy to be able to relay those on to our speakers at that time. So without further ado, let's hear from PPF's President and CEO, Edward Greenspan. The floor is yours, Ed.
Okay, thank you, Yolande. Thank you for hosting. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the direction. That's great. I could have read this entire thing into the wind, which would be a shame. So I'm Ed Greenspan, everyone. Je m'appelle Ed Greenspan, président et directeur général du Fonds de politique publique. And welcome to, as Yolande says, our 5th annual Rebuild Canada Growth Summit. Our first growth summit in 2016 provided an early showcase of the policy work being led at the time by Dominic Barton on the Economic Growth Council. We called that first Canada Growth Summit Beyond 2%, the idea being the tremendous difference to the lives of Canadians of good policy or bad policy decisions could swing plus or minus 1% growth or 0.5% a year of growth. Today, we gather to talk about economic growth and participation in it amidst one of the great economic contractions of any of our lifetimes. Coming out of COVID, the additions and subtractions of good and bad public policy will be all the more critical. It was in this context that the Public Policy Forum decided within weeks of the intrusion of the pandemic into our lives last March that deep thought would have to be given not just to how we emerge from an enforced lockdown, but how things might change in the area of policy demands and be different. We designed a plan that we called Rebuild Canada that suggested the pandemic would give rise to an entirely new set of policy issues on the one hand, while at the same time changing the trajectory of pre-existing issues. We said governments and other decision makers needed to prepare themselves to address policy weaknesses that would be exposed by the crisis, such as supply chain security, income support programs, long-term care, alongside a heightened urgency that would attach itself to matters already within the policy imagination, such as future work issues, which suddenly had become present of work issues. And all this would be happening within the constraints on ambition, starting with an unprecedented spike in public debt and greater geopolitical tumult. Now, how would Canadians react to all this and the toll it would extract? We posed the question in that first planning memo. Are we in a 1945 moment where collective sacrifice led to new expectations and sweeping policy reform? Or is it a 2008-9 moment where crisis was managed into submission and society largely returned to normal? This would present choices for policymakers and choices for anyone in the community of policy, including voters. And the answer, I don't think, is fully clear yet, but I commend the papers that have been published so far too. They're available on our PPF website. From the first Canada Growth Summit forward, one of PPF's key areas of concentration has been what we call the economics and social determinants of growth. And that is what we are discussing again during the session starting today and carrying out over the next several weeks. This year's Growth Summit builds on that work of our Rebuild Canada process, aiming to use the COVID-19 pandemic as a catalyst to a more productive, competitive, and fairer Canadian economy and society. And just to finish up, let me say, in the darkness of this pandemic, I think for everybody, one can identify some positives. For some people, it's a different kind of family life. It's a renewal of things that are basic and important. I'd also say for PPF and for many other organizations, it's an unlocking of creativity in terms of how you can get things done and what is really possible. And it's also been a really wonderful look into the depth and quality of the relationships with our various partners, all of whom have stood up and stepped up for us over these past 7 months. So Yolande has already identified them, but I also want to add my word of thanks to all our partners. And finally, a big thank you to the PPF team and to Yolande, our host, for all the sessions at this year's Virtual Growth Summit. I've commended you have a look at some of the papers. I also suggest you might want to put in your calendar some of the dates of sessions coming up, including the next one, I think, maybe on October 27th with the CEOs of Canada's 2 large airports, which have been crippled by this pandemic, Greater Toronto Airport Authority and Deborah Flint, and the Greater Vancouver Airport Authority and Tamara Vrooman. So with that, I turn it back to Yolande, and I thank Brian and Stephen in advance for what I know will be a stimulating discussion.
Yes, thank you so much. So let's get started with that discussion. I'm going to introduce our panelists, and Brian will be moderating the discussion. Stephen Poloz is widely recognized economist with nearly 40 years of experience in financial markets, forecasting, and economic policy, including 35 years in the public sector. Prior to joining Osler, Stephen was the 9th governor of the Bank of Canada, Canada's central bank. Stephen was governor of the bank for 7 years after having previously spent 14 years there during 1981-1995, occupying a range of increasingly senior positions. Prior to joining the Bank of Canada, Stephen spent 14 years at Export Development Canada as chief economist from 1999 to 2008, head of lending from 2008 to 2011, and finally as president and CEO from 2011 to 2013. He also spent 4 years at BCA Research, where he was managing editor of the International Bank Credit Analyst, one of the flagship publications. Stephen is a certified international trade professional and a graduate of Columbia University's Senior Executive Program. He has been a visiting scholar at the International Monetary Fund in Washington, D.C., and at the Economic Planning Agency in Tokyo, Japan. He is a frequent speaker and writer and has taught economics at the University of Western Ontario, Concordia University, and Queen's School of Business. At Osler, Stephen provides clients with his significant expertise and strategic guidance regarding the financial system, trade, and economic policy, both domestically and on the global scale. And Brian Bohenicki. Brian is Vice President of Policy at PPF. Brian came to PPF after an outstanding policy career within the Government of Canada, including positions in transport, agriculture, fisheries, and oceans, defense, public services and procurement, PCO, and the forerunner to ESDC. He has worked on both the public service and political sides, as well as in the private sector. Brian is a graduate of the University of Manitoba and the University of Oxford, which he attended as a Rhodes Scholar. So, two impressive gentlemen. On that note, Brian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Yolanda, and thank you, Ed. Hello, Stephen. Thanks for being with us at the Growth Summit today. Let's jump right in. I want to start with a decidedly non-economist kind of question. What was it like? What did it feel like as your term, your very eventful 7-year term as governor of the Bank of Canada was winding down, and the world starts confronting early this year the greatest and most threatening and tragic pandemic in a century that it becomes clearer by the day, I would think, is going to lead to the biggest economic catastrophe in our lifetimes. You were there in a uniquely important role at a unique time. What was it like? What was a day in the office like in those crucial days when we still were going to offices?
Well, thanks for starting with an easy question, Brian. Appreciate that. But thanks very much to the PPF for inviting me to be here today and for your kind words up front there. Well, what was it like? You know, I remember the penny dropping when we were at the G20 meeting in Riyadh. That was in mid-February. And we were listening to a couple of speakers from Asia, like one from Singapore, for example, describing what they were doing, what they were going through. And it just started to really take shape at that point that this could be truly big and global. And if it was, it would be one of the biggest things we'd ever confronted. And I guess one of my first reactions was, well, this is what central banks were made for. You know, if we're going to have financial convulsions and so on, well, that's why we have central banks. All that stuff about inflation targeting and so on, that's a pretty recent phenomenon by comparison. And also I remember thinking, well, at least we're in this together. We have a very collegial central bank community and finance minister community. And back here at the ranch, a really strong team at the bank. And some of those people, like Carolyn Wilkins, for example, who had been there during the 2008 crisis. I was at EDC at the time, so a little different kind of setting, but lived it and was right there on top of it immediately. So more or less, you know, it wasn't scary in a sense, but at the same time, it was daunting. I'll say daunting. You know, the challenge looked very large. That's for sure.
And so you went from daunting to action. Of course, the Bank of Canada was an integral part of Canada's response efforts to protect the Canadian economy with some unprecedented actions, particularly with respect to buying financial assets, especially, but not only government bonds, at a rate of $5 billion a week.
Mhm.
That was unprecedented in scope, I'm sure. But why was that necessary? What was the thinking that went into that plan? And I'm wondering what would have happened if you hadn't done that?
Mm. Well, I mean, what you're talking about is one of the cores of our economy. In fact, the government bond market is truly foundational to the economy. It's a place where anybody in the economy can get instant liquidity. What's liquidity all about? Well, when people are frightened, when they're unsure about the future, liquidity is what they want. Um, and it can be investors deciding they no longer wish to be exposed to either the stock market or the bond market, or both. It can be companies whose boards would have been screaming at them to get as much cash as possible on board so that they could weather whatever storm came along. Liquidity is the key. And so what happens with everybody doing roughly the same thing, markets can really get tightened up, even seize up, and become dysfunctional. And so the immediate reaction of central banks in this situation is to open up the window and to be doing repo agreements, instantly, and in scale, and as well tackling dysfunction in the markets in every dimension. Like you've mentioned, government bond markets, but it was also commercial paper markets, provincial bond markets across the spectrum. And so when those markets were functioning well, and actually they began to function well pretty quickly after those interventions, it meant that everybody in the economy could do what it is they wanted to do. And mainly it was, as I said, to gather liquidity. So over time, when tensions ease, as this thing goes behind us and things are returning more progressively to normal, people will require less liquidity and they'll give it back, and it'll go back through the system, and much of that will reverse. So that's just what central banks are made for.
What kind of time frame do you think will be required for that unwinding to take place? And is there any reason for us to be concerned with the Bank of Canada controlling something over 50%, I think, of the government debt market in the meantime?
Well, first of all, the underlying disturbance is still there. As we know, we're entering a second wave. Throughout the last several months, markets have been functioning extraordinarily well. In fact, comparing this episode to the 2008 crisis, the banking system has functioned extraordinarily well. Lending is up tremendously during this time frame, whereas there was a true contraction of credit going on back in 2008. That's what we were doing at EDC, was helping to fill the gap that the private sector was leaving behind in a very difficult situation. So this is quite different from that point of view. The markets have functioned very well, and partly it's because the central banks, and I don't just mean in Canada, but all around, were very quick, and they took those lessons to heart from 2008. Mm-hmm. Now, the balance sheets of central banks will shrink again as those repos unwind. That'll happen in due course. As I said, when things settle down, uncertainty is still pretty high, right? So it's not going to happen right away, and I don't like to put an exact time frame on it, but I have to believe that a year from now we'll be looking back on this and writing the retrospectives and taking our lessons, and I hopefully much sooner than that. That would be my hope, and I think a reasonable expectation.